And Joe Rowlands, an old colleague at Oxfam, Great Britain, back in the 90s, produced a great book. And from this, we have seen this discussion about different forms of power. Because international relations and politics tends to focus just on power over, getting A to do B, even if they don't want to, which is a very narrow understanding of power. And as we've seen a lot in the literature from the churches, transformational development literature, the role of power within is important, the ability to feel like you can make change happen. The role of power with collective action, collective power, and the power to. I think one of the things that always struck me in Indigenous communities in Australia is the feeling of people saying to themselves, we have no power to do anything. We've given up. And that is the worst possible form of psychological disempowerment. We've then got another kind of take that Duncan talks about, which is about visible power, which is really those things one can see in terms of laws, regulations, budgets, policies. Hidden power about who gets to the table, who gets excluded from the table, and invisible power, the norms and attitudes that are taken for granted. So an example, in relation to gender-based violence, visible power is the domain, for example, of domestic legislation, making rape in marriage a crime, for example, or providing an adequate budget for prosecutions. And that demands certain strategies to achieve. Hidden power might concern who gets a seat at the table to inform priorities and decisions, i.e., are representatives of women's movements at the table? Are the issues which are considered legitimate to address, for example, numbers of female police, are those women's representatives able to put those issues on the table, or are they excluded from the agenda? Who sets the agenda? And invisible power is the domain of men and women's attitudes to, for example, whether it's okay or normal for a husband to beat his wife. Now, obviously, that's a much deeper set of issues. And what we start to see is the difference between those things that are below the waterline, in one sense, the invisible power of motives, ethics, beliefs, norms, and how they relate to behaviours that are more visible, laws, legislations, budgets, policies. And this is important because these things require different ways of thinking about change, different strategies for change. And if we try and do change norms using a policy campaigning process that is used to changing policies and laws, that's not going to work. So it's, I think, useful in disentangling these. And finally, culture. Now, we're going to talk much more about this, and Deborah's going to do a whole session on this. A number of studies have been done on different cultures and the different dimensions of those cultures and how they differ. This is one example. Deborah's going to talk more about this. But it's quite clear that issues, for example, of power, which we've just been talking about, but there are actually very different attitudes across cultures to power and hierarchy and gender difference. And that if we don't take that into account, then the conversation we have with activists, with change agents in different parts of the world is going to be very hard. And that's the same in terms of our Western attitudes to individualism versus collectivism, attitudes to our comfort with ambiguity and uncertainty versus others. And this just illustrates some of the studies done comparing the United States and China, where there are quite large differences between those elements. Something we'll come back to. And I guess where I'm finishing is trying to bring this together, that understanding the complexity of the world and all of the things we've talked about, there's ways of doing that. But if we don't factor in different ways of thinking about power, then that understanding is going to be poorer for it. But if we don't also understand how different worldviews relate to both power and complexity and comfort with uncertainty, then we also miss a trick. And I think what we've seen in the past, we've seen a lot of emphasis recently on complexity, which has been important, but is some of it, particularly some of the stuff coming out of the management literature and the rest of it, has ignored this question of power. And a lot of the discussion on power and complexity ignores the domain of culture and how different worldviews see these things. So the proposition I'm putting to you is that that may be helpful, you may disagree, in how we then think about the complexity of the world.